You wake up to a headline that instantly stops you in your tracks. Bryan Kohberger, the man once branded as the face of one of America's most chilling campus murders, has been released from prison. Officials confirmed late last night that key DNA evidence, originally used to tie him directly to the murders of 4 University of Idaho students, has now been declared faulty. This revelation did not just shake the courtroom, it sent shockwaves through the entire nation, reopening a case many thought was sealed forever. For years, prosecutors built their narrative around the knife sheath discovered at the scene, claiming it contained Coberger's DNA. But according to new reports, the laboratory responsible for the testing admitted to a catastrophic error in the chain of custody. Documents reveal that the sample may have been cross-contaminated with another case, meaning the so-called match that prosecutors relied on could have been nothing more than a mix-up. In response, the defense pushed for an immediate review, and the judge, citing wrongful imprisonment concerns, granted Coberger a temporary release while further investigations unfold. As news broke, the families of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin sat in visible disbelief. Inside the courtroom, sobs and gasps echoed through the packed benches, while others stormed out in anger, unable to comprehend how such a critical mistake could go unnoticed for nearly 3 years. Social media erupted with outrage overnight, with critics demanding accountability for the forensic teams and prosecutors who pushed for life sentences on compromised evidence. And now the question hangs heavy in the air. If the DNA never truly tied Coberger to the crime scene, what does this mean for the case and for justice itself? Would you still believe the prosecution's story after learning this? You hear the courtroom erupt in chaos as Bryan Kohberger steps out in plain clothing, no longer shackled in chains. For the first time since his 2022 arrest, he was able to walk freely past the flashing cameras. Supporters of the victim shouted from the gallery, with one family member reportedly yelling, "This is a disgrace. He should never walk free." Others sat frozen, stunned that the very evidence that secured his conviction had now unraveled in front of the world. Court records revealed that the turning point came when an independent lab, hired by the defense, reviewed the original DNA sample. Their analysis showed the alleged direct match was in fact a degraded partial profile that never should have been presented as conclusive. Legal analysts are now blasting the initial investigators, saying that the state rushed to secure an arrest and built its entire case around what is now being described as junk science. Meanwhile, Coberger's attorneys wasted no time declaring victory. One of them told reporters, "Our client has suffered years of wrongful imprisonment based on faulty forensics. Today is not just about Bryan, it's about accountability in a justice system that failed." On the other hand, prosecutors warned that his release is temporary, insisting that new forensic testing could still place him at the crime scene once verified under stricter standards. As Coberger walked out, escorted by deputies for his own safety, cameras captured him glancing briefly at the victims' families before lowering his head. The haunting silence that followed raised an uncomfortable question. How could such a high-profile case hinge on evidence that experts are now calling unreliable? And if this can happen here, how many other wrongful convictions could be hidden behind flawed DNA testing? Would you trust the system after seeing this unfold? You wake up to breaking headlines blasting across every major news outlet. Bryan Kohberger, once sentenced to multiple life terms without parole, has been released after a stunning revelation that the DNA evidence tying him to the crime was flawed. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere is nothing short of explosive. Protesters held up signs reading, "Justice for the Four," while others screamed at law enforcement, accusing them of mishandling the case from the very beginning. Inside the courtroom, documents showed how the original DNA sample, found on the knife sheath at the crime scene, had been improperly handled and cross-contaminated during lab processing. Forensic specialists who reviewed the chain of custody admitted under questioning that multiple people had access to the sample, making it impossible to guarantee its purity. This single error, amplified by mounting legal pressure, forced the judge to reverse Coberger's conviction and grant his release. The families of the 4 slain students sat in disbelief, with tears streaming as they listened to the decision. One parent was quoted saying, "This is a nightmare all over again. We trusted the system to protect our children, and now we have to face the reality that their killer might be free." Meanwhile, Coberger himself remained stoic. Witnesses said he barely blinked when the ruling was read, only nodding slightly before being led out of the room. For many watching, his silence carried more weight than any words could. Across the country, legal experts warned that this case could spark a wave of appeals from other inmates convicted primarily on DNA evidence. And now people are wondering, if a case this high profile could collapse on such shaky forensic ground, what does that mean for the future of DNA testing in criminal trials? Would you still view DNA as the gold standard of justice, or has this case shattered that trust? You hear the outrage echoing beyond Idaho as national commentators and legal analysts begin dissecting the collapse of the case against Bryan Kohberger. For years, prosecutors had painted DNA as the undeniable link between him and the brutal stabbings of 4 University of Idaho students. Yet, with the evidence now deemed unreliable, questions flood the public square. Was this incompetence, negligence, or something far more sinister within the justice system? On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForThe4 and #DNA debacle trended within hours of his release. Thousands of users accused law enforcement of mishandling the investigation, while others argued that this revelation proved Coberger may have been wrongfully convicted all along. Talk shows debated the fine line between technical errors and systemic failure, with one commentator stating, "If DNA can be manipulated or contaminated this easily, then no conviction is truly safe." The victims' families, already devastated by the initial crime, were thrust back into the spotlight. Some pleaded for federal intervention, demanding that the FBI step in to review the case from the ground up. Others shared raw frustration at having to endure another chapter of uncertainty, describing the release as a betrayal. Meanwhile, Coberger's defense attorneys declared victory, framing their client as a man who endured years of wrongful imprisonment due to what they called sloppy science. They promised he would pursue legal action for damages, including the violation of his constitutional rights. In stark contrast, prosecutors scrambled to reassure the public that the fight for justice was not over, even as their credibility eroded with every passing hour. And now the lingering question grows louder. If this could happen in such a closely watched case, how many other convictions rest on evidence that could crumble under similar scrutiny? Would you still feel secure knowing your justice system might be built on such fragile foundations? You wake up to the sight of reporters swarming outside the courthouse as Bryan Kohberger, flanked by his legal team, makes his first public appearance since walking free. Cameras flash relentlessly, capturing every twitch of his expression, while protesters chant furiously from behind barricades. Some hold signs demanding "Justice for the 4", while others shockingly raise placards reading "Set up from the start." The atmosphere feels less like a legal proceeding and more like a battle for public perception. Inside, legal experts wasted no time drawing parallels to infamous wrongful conviction cases, comparing Coberger's release to past debacles, where flawed forensic science led to overturned verdicts. One former prosecutor commented, "This isn't just a mistake, it's a seismic collapse that undermines public trust nationwide." Meanwhile, Coberger's attorney doubled down on the narrative of innocence, asserting that his client had been the victim of a rush to judgment, fueled by public hysteria and sloppy evidence handling. Court documents revealed that the DNA originally tying Coberger to the crime scene came from a contaminated sample mishandled in the lab. The discovery shattered years of certainty, leaving investigators scrambling to explain how such a high-profile case could unravel over basic forensic protocols. The victims' families were reportedly inconsolable. Parents described the moment they heard the news as reliving the nightmare all over again, while others sat silently in court, their faces a mixture of rage and disbelief. A mother whispered to reporters, "Who do we even trust anymore? The system has failed us twice now." As speculation mounts, law enforcement remains tight-lipped, promising a renewed investigation, but offering little clarity on what comes next. Meanwhile, the public is left torn, half convinced of Coberger's guilt, the other half suddenly entertaining the idea that he may never have been the killer at all. If you were standing in that courthouse, surrounded by both fury and celebration, which side would you believe? Would you still see him as guilty, or would the cracks in the system make you question everything? You hear the courthouse gavel echo sharply, cutting through the chaos as the judge adjourns the day's proceedings. Outside, the frenzy only intensifies. News outlets broadcast live, their headlines shifting in real time. Coberger walks free, justice system in crisis, DNA, evidence crumbles. Social media platforms ignite with polarized reactions. Hashtags like #JusticeForThe4 trend alongside #Free Coberger, fueling one of the most divisive debates in recent memory. Legal analysts warned that the implications could stretch far beyond this single case. Defense attorneys across the country may now revisit convictions secured through similar DNA methods, arguing that the same errors could have tainted their clients' trials. One analyst explained, "This is a legal earthquake. Every prosecutor who built a case on this kind of forensic evidence is now on unstable ground." Meanwhile, police officials find themselves under growing scrutiny. Calls for accountability ring out as critics demand to know who signed off on the lab work that led to the wrongful incarceration. Whispers suggest that high-ranking figures within law enforcement were aware of inconsistencies long before they surfaced publicly, raising questions of negligence, or worse, intentional cover-ups. For the victims' families, the pain only deepens. One father described the day's events as a second stabbing of the heart, while siblings of the slain students lashed out at authorities for failing them at every stage. Vigils across Idaho turned into protests, with candles replaced by fiery chants demanding the case be reopened and justice pursued relentlessly. And yet, a small but vocal group of supporters gathered in front of the courthouse, embracing Coberger's release as vindication. They claim the system unfairly targeted him due to his criminology background and eccentric behavior, rather than hard facts. To them, the DNA error wasn't just a mistake. It was proof of a larger narrative of wrongful persecution. Now, the central question looms larger than ever. If Coberger didn't commit the murders, then who did? And how many years of misdirection have allowed the real killer to walk free? Would you still place faith in the investigators, or do you believe this case has shattered their credibility for good? You wake up the next morning to headlines plastered across every major outlet, all carrying the same chilling message. Bryan Kohberger is no longer behind bars. What was once considered a closed chapter in one of Idaho's darkest crimes has now exploded into a storm of uncertainty. The supposed airtight case that prosecutors built on DNA has collapsed, and the ripple effect is spreading far beyond the courthouse. Across the country, criminal justice advocates and defense attorneys are seizing on the news. They argue that Coberger's release may trigger a tidal wave of appeals, reopening cases once believed to be firmly settled. Some warn that decades of convictions relying on similar forensic practices could now face renewed scrutiny, with countless families forced to relive their tragedies in pursuit of answers. Others argue this exposes a justice system too dependent on science that can be mishandled or misinterpreted. Inside Idaho, the reaction is visceral. The families of Madison Mogan, Kaylee Goncalves, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin have been left devastated once again, facing the grim possibility that justice for their loved ones may never come. Candlelight vigils that once symbolized hope now flicker with anger, the chants of justice for the four echoing late into the night. Social media burns with fury, speculation, and conspiracy theories, some blaming prosecutors, others pointing fingers at law enforcement or even political influence behind the scenes. Coberger himself has remained silent, escorted out of prison under tight security before disappearing to an undisclosed location. His attorneys, however, wasted no time celebrating the ruling, framing it as proof that the system, despite its flaws, can self-correct. But for a nation gripped by this story from the very beginning, the question is not about legal technicalities, it's about trust. The murders of 4 young students remain unsolved, their families now watching helplessly as the man once accused walks free. For many, the most haunting thought lingers in the air. If Bryan Kohberger didn't do it, then the real killer is still out there. And as the investigation begins to unravel, the nation is left asking, was justice ever truly within